Let me ask you this question. What is your favorite movie? Or more specifically, what is your favorite part of your favorite movie? If I were betting, it's probably not the beginning or the middle, but it's probably the end. You see, the end of a story or the end of a movie is so important. It's where everything comes together. It's when the movie is at its most crucial point. Well, in this next series that we are about to do, we are going to be going through some of the most crucial parts in the most important story. As we walk through the final moments of Jesus' life in this sermon series called Famous Last Words, I cannot wait for you to hear some of the most important teachings, some of the most important sayings about Jesus' final time here on earth leading up to the cross. So, without further ado, get ready for this next series, Famous Last Words.
When I think of famous last words, I can only think of one man and one man only, and that's the late great Kobe Bryant. Kobe Bryant's life was a life that I idolized. He was the true GOAT. The Mamba mentality is something that lives on in all of us forever. Kobe Bryant had one of the greatest last seasons ever, but not only that, he had one of the greatest last games ever. In his last game, he dropped about 60 points, I believe, and had one of the greatest farewell games of all time. But after that game, he stood center court and he gave a heartfelt message to the Laker community. And he simply said, when he got done with that, Mamba out. He blew a kiss to his fans and he said, Mamba out. And those last words, they live in my heart forever. Now that Kobe Bryant has passed over into the next life, it's like Mamba out truly has another meaning, has another intensity to it and in my life. And I just love Kobe in the way that he lived his life. But when we think of famous last words, we can think of Jesus when he talked to his disciples at the Passover meal. And we think about it in a biblical context and how that shaped the world and how that redefined how we looked at the Passover meal and how we celebrated the Passover meal. But our text that we're going to be in is Luke 22, verses 19 through 20. It says, he took some of the bread and gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it into pieces and gave it to his disciples, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. After supper, he took another cup of wine and said, this is the cup of the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you. The bottom line as we go through this message, we have to remember what God has done for us. Some of you may have complicated feelings about the Bible, but no matter what you think about the Bible, the truth is the Bible is a great place to go when you want to know what Jesus said. And whether or not you believe everything you've heard in the Bible, no one can doubt that his words have shaped and redefined culture in many incredible ways. And the fact that it is written down is amazing because we all have the tendency to forget. We forget where we put our retainers, we forget where we put our phones, we forget where we put the TV remote sometimes. But our tendency to forget can impact us in ways that we couldn't even imagine. For those of you who call yourselves Jesus followers, our ability to forget can hinder our relationship with God in incredible ways. And that may sound strange, but think about it. Don't we all have a hard time remembering all the good things that God has done for us in our lives? Or allowed us to be a part of, especially when things go bad in our lives. We're like, God, where are you? Do you even care about me? Why won't you do something about this terrible situation that I'm going through? We tend to blame God for all the difficult circumstances that we're facing in our life right now, while forgetting all the great things that he has brought us through in the past. We do the same thing with the people that are around us that we're closest to. And that's a problem when it comes to our faith, because our faith sometimes, it's the thing that keeps us going. Because we'll all face difficult situations in our life, and we're told that we should trust God throughout those difficult situations. We should trust God that he's good, that he loves us, and that he cares for us. But we just don't feel that way sometimes. Sometimes we just get so worried and so consumed with all the negativity around us that we just don't feel that way. We get so focused on what we're facing that we forget that God has done so many incredible things for us in the past. And if we aren't careful and we focus on all the negative things that are around us, we can convince ourselves of two things. One, that God isn't there, and two, that God doesn't care. But a question that I want to pose to you early in this message is, when things go wrong, how can you make sure that our attention and our focus isn't consumed by the bad things in our lives? On this particular evening, Jesus and his disciples were sharing a very, very important meal. It was a Passover meal. The disciples didn't know that this would be Jesus' last meal with him, but Jesus did. And knowing this, Jesus shared some important things with him. Imagine if you were having the last meal with the people that you cared for the most. Your words are going to be your last words forever. My guess is you wouldn't talk about the latest Netflix show or the latest Drake album. You would say something that'll be important, that would last in your family member's heart for a long time. But if you're like me, you wouldn't know exactly what you would say. You would just come up with something that you would think would be clever and you would say it. You don't want those words to matter, I bet. It's easy to imagine that Jesus felt the same way. His last words shaped history and the future forever. They completely redefined what it meant to trust God. But before we get into exactly what Jesus said, I need to share some context with you. God miraculously saved the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt from the Egyptian Pharaoh. God sent a new plague to drive Pharaoh crazy and to speed up the whole process of getting them out of slavery. There was a wave of dead fish, there was a wave of frogs, and there was a wave of bugs. This story is wild, but over and over, God sent a new plague getting progressively harder and harder and harder to help speed up the process of getting getting the Jews out of slavery. The last plague was really awful. The firstborn male child of every family died. Morbid, I know, but for the Jewish family, this meant a way out, a way of escape. This sounds crazy, but hang in there with me for a second. The Jews were told to place lamb's blood on their doors to symbolize they are of Jewish descent. And in the night of the plague, God would pass over their houses, allowing their firstborn males to live. To make a very long story short, the Jewish people did and obeyed these instructions perfectly, and their children were saved. And this plague caused so much pain in Egypt that Pharaoh finally allowed the Jewish people to leave, and it meant an end to the slavery there. But from that moment on, the Jewish people had a tradition of remembering the Passover. They celebrated how God and their ancestors were saved with the Passover meal. Year after year, they sit around the table, and much like we do for Christmas or Thanksgiving, and they retell the stories of how they were saved. But I love this because they made a habit of remembering. They didn't just assume that they would always know that God was faithful and that God would bring them out of slavery and that God was trustworthy for them. Instead, they set aside time and they got intentional with it. They remembered the stories by telling the stories, and they put it on their calendar and they marked it. And just like our holiday traditions, it included food. Parts of their meal involved eating unleavened bread and drinking wine. I know this sounds like a boring history lesson, but 1 minute as I explain about that a little more quickly. Unleavened bread was made without yeast, which represented how quickly the Israelites left Egypt. There was no time to wait for the bread to rise. The wine represented the blood of the lambs that was sacrificed for the Jewish people. As we go back and we look further into our text and we read it again, it says, "He took some of the bread and gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it into pieces and gave it to his disciples. 'This is my body, which is given to you. Do this in remembrance of me.' After supper, he took another cup of wine and said, 'This is a cup of the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you.'" It may not sound like much, but that was a huge moment. Jesus had flipped a switch. He had just changed the meaning of the whole tradition. And they had celebrated and remembered what God had done long ago in Egypt. But now in this moment, they had to remember him and what he did. But remember, at this moment, Jesus hadn't died yet. Jesus said that the bread and the wine now represented his body and his blood. In other words, he was saying, these symbols now represent my incredible love for you, which has compelled me to live with you and to die for you. Every time you eat this bread and you drink this wine, I want you to do one thing. I want you to remember, he said. Remember me, remember my sacrifice for you, and remember my great love for you. That's pretty cool, right? Jesus made this ordinary thing of bread and wine, and he made it extraordinary. He made it huge. Jesus knew that in that moment, that when things got bad and when things got tough, we'll have the tendency to forget. We'll have the tendency to focus on the bad things and forget all the good things that he brought us through. We'll wonder where God is and why he isn't doing anything to help us in that situation. We'll forget all the great things that he had brought us through. Jesus knows that we have the tendency to forget. That's why when he was talking to his disciples, he got intentional about it. He gave them one message and one message only. Remember what God has done for you. Now, as I wrap up and as I close, I can guarantee you this. You are 100% guaranteed to go through tough situations in your life. But it's on you to make the choice that you won't allow your tough situations or the circumstances that you're facing in life to derail you from your faith. You have to remember and rely on the God that has brought you through many, many, many situations in the past. But as I close and as I finish this message, I want to challenge you to do one thing. I want you to remember the God that has been there for you from the beginning.